The first question was about evacuation, and I think there's 2 points with evacuation. One is a planned evacuation, such as a coastal storm. When we ask people to evacuate, it's kind of on a day like today. It's not in the middle of a storm. There aren't crazy winds blowing. There isn't rain coming down in sheets. Lawn furniture isn't flying through the air. That's kind of the picture that people have. We ask people to evacuate 2 to 3 days in advance. That can be a hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing for the city and for a mayor to call for an evacuation, because if people perceive you over-evacuate, then they think that you cried wolf and they're angry. If you under-evacuate, you put people at serious risk. And as I said, it's not an exact science. So we use all of our modeling and talk to the health commissioner and other people about that. But for example, during Irene, that hit a Saturday night, I think overnight Saturday night, and I think the evacuation was called on Thursday. So that gave people, I think the subways were shut down Saturday at noon, so that gave people about 36 hours using public transportation to evacuate. Sandy, because of the timing with the weekend and other uncertainty, if anybody was watching the Weather Channel around Wednesday, all but one model showed Sandy going out to sea, and then we woke up Thursday morning and all of a sudden every model showed it going back in, so we were catching up to that a little bit. But the mandatory evacuation for Zone 1 and some extra parts, such as the Rockaways and City Island, was given, I believe, Saturday afternoon. The subway shut down Sunday evening around 7 o'clock, so that was probably a 26-hour window. But there were many operations. One thing that I think that came up here is what if people need assistance evacuating? If you're not taking the subway or your car or something like that. The city has something called Homebound Evacuation Operation, HEO we call it, and that's managed through 311 with the MTA, with Accessoride and the fire department. So if anyone needs, once an evacuation is called, if anyone needs special assistance getting to a special medical needs shelter or an evacuation center, you can call 311 and they will schedule for either someone from the fire department or the MTA to come pick you up and bring you to your destination. For Sandy, because that was both of us work in the city's emergency operations center, I run one of the teams, and I was there Sunday, all day Monday. 73 people called to use that service. And we actually kept it open much longer. That we had planned to shut it down when the subway shut down. We kept it running through Sunday night, and actually only 73 people used that, which was we had thousands of vehicles lined up for that. So that's something that we want to publicize. That if anybody needs help, they should call 311, get in the queue, and we can help you with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about local evacuation options?
Hi, so as Christina said, there are 2 closest local evacuation centers for residents of Roosevelt Island. One of them is Newcomers High School, which is in Queens, and the other is Julia Richmond School, which is in Manhattan. And basically you would get to these evacuation centers the same way that you would go about your business on a regular day, assuming that you were able to do so. So in order to get to the one in Manhattan, you could take the tram, you could take the F train. The information on when the MTA is shutting down would be publicized well beforehand. Roosevelt Island Operating Corps also works with OEM. They provide information on when they plan on shutting down the tram. That's information that we would also have up. I assume that they would have up as well. So you would be able to plan your evacuation accordingly. Same thing if you wanted to evacuate to Queens. You could take the F train again to 21st Street and then walk, or you could take the Q102 bus. So there are options, and also important to note that the Julia Richmond School is a special medical needs shelter. So if you were evacuating with your family and a member of your family needed particular attention, you could evacuate to that shelter. You could stay with your family member. You wouldn't be separated. So that's something I think that's important for people to take note of. And pets are welcome at all shelters. Yeah. All pets.
Thank you. So one other kind of an offshoot of this question, which I think may get a little outside of the scope of tonight, but something we wanted to address is a non-coastal storm evacuation. We tend to call that a no-notice evacuation. So there are, some types in that. There could be a smaller event, like if there were a partial power outage on the island, if there were a fire, where, a water break, those kind of things where a few of the buildings had to be evacuated. OEM has worked with Department of Education, with the police department, fire department. We can open up smaller shelters. So the school on the island could be opened up. Last year there was a fire in Brooklyn on New York Avenue, and there was a lightning strike, and it lit the roof on fire, and it clearly wasn't safe for people to stay in there. There was a school a few blocks away. We worked with the Red Cross and other agencies to open up that school, and people stayed there while they made longer-term arrangements. That's something similar we would do if it was safe, for a part of the island residents whose building wasn't safe to stay. If it's a situation where the entire island had to be evacuated quickly, that's obviously something that the operating corporation, I'm sure, is heavily involved in. OEM looks at evacuation across the city. We work with police, fire, EMS, MTA, the Coast Guard, all of the main players, there are many, to look at different options, and if the subways aren't available, if the bridge is out of service, it's kind of hard to go through every different what if, but we look at different options and what would be the ways to get people out safely and orderly. Well, it would fall into a larger PD response, looking at Queens North and the local precinct and how they were evacuating people.
And in line with getting information, I also want to give a plug to Notify New York City, which is a program that you can sign up for. It is an opt-in program. You can call 311, you can go to our website and sign up for it. And you can sign up for information throughout the entire city or only for the geographic area. If you're only interested in what's going on Roosevelt Island or where you work, you can put in your specifics and you'll get information on what's going on. And those of you who were signed up know this when there was the power outage in May, that there was information coming out, that we were trying to push information out to people. There are not a significant amount of people on Roosevelt Island signed up for this right now, so it's something that we would urge you to strongly consider. You can talk to us about it afterwards. You can visit our website. Some of the buildings do sign up for it and post that information. My building posted it in the lobbies. I know that the blog posted. I see the information being passed around, but it's also very good to sign up yourself for this. So it's called Notify New York City.
Give us that address
the website? Well, you can go to www.nyc.gov/OEM, and you can get the information there, or you can call 311 and they can direct you to the website, or they can walk you through the process of signing up.
Thank you. And one thing I want to mention about Notify NYC is that it's available in all different categories. You can get a text, you can get an email, you can get a phone call to a landline. You can also follow it on Twitter. So it's not just, and you can sign up by calling 311, so it's not just a technology resource. It's available to anyone in the city that at least has a phone. And I think you may have said that Roosevelt Island has its own zip code, and so there are specific, like if there's an issue with the tram or when the power outage happened, that comes specifically. So if you wanted to just get information about Roosevelt Island and then significant citywide events, you could do that. And then you can also type in, if you work somewhere, if your kids go to school somewhere, you can type in other zip codes. One thing that Frank just mentioned, which I'm glad to have his word for it in addition to ours, is with the evacuation centers and the shelters, we specifically, we looked at, not to dig at our, brethren in Louisiana, but we looked very carefully at what happened down in New Orleans to make sure that things like that didn't happen here. We don't have a Superdome strategy. We don't send people to Madison Square Garden or to, large cavernous facilities like that. We specifically picked small schools that are manageable. As he just asked me to mention, they are clean, they are patrolled, they're safe, people are separated, families, single people, religious observance, all different categories, and as Rachel said, all pets are welcome. We have a whole different supply for pets. I was involved in some of the siting of some of the new shelters because some of our old shelters are now in evacuation zones as they moved up, and one thing we made sure is that there are separate rooms because some people really want to be with pets, other people just as violently don't want to be with pets. So there's a separate area for that. You can go down and visit your pet, all of those things, and as Rachel also said, we don't separate families. So if people have special medical needs, we can accommodate that you can stay with your family or stay with your friends. Does that answer most of your questions, or are there anything
That answers all my questions. Does anybody else have questions? Yes. I think what I'd like to do, I'd like to take a few minutes and write your questions down and we'll collect them. Could you write your questions down? We'll start with I'll give them, everybody write your questions down, and I'm going to give the mic to the one person who raised her hand so we can get this started. Who's the closest? Okay, great. Great.
46, approximately.
Hello. I am a member of CERT, and you brought up an interesting question about evacuation that is not on the basis of a coastal storm, something that might be a modified kind of evacuation, something we've discussed on the island for many years now. There are several sites on the island that might be appropriate for an evacuation where only one or two buildings are involved. But the site has not been chosen, and I'm wondering if this is something that OEM might want to involve itself with in finding a site, announcing that site to the community so people have prior knowledge of that site, so if communication is a problem, that people will know what is expected of them, and perhaps even stocking that site with basic material, pots, blankets, potable water, things of that sort.
Thank you. Outside of the coastal storm and designating these, what the city does is we really look at city-owned facilities, such as the Department of Education building here or something, because our experience has shown us, and this happened to us actually during Irene, that we had some private, not city-owned facilities, which I'm sure were very well-meaning and, wanted to be good citizens and part of the process, and, some of them didn't return our calls, they weren't open, some of them may have not had the experience that they expected during Irene, so they told us they weren't interested after that. There's certain liability, there's a lot of different things that goes into citing shelters, but Rachel and I were speaking yesterday about community centers and churches and things. The city, OEM has very general plans for how we would site things. We know how many square feet people need. We have supplies. Some are in the city, some are in New Jersey and other places slightly out of our evacuation zone in case there were larger things. We don't, as a rule, pre-position because we don't necessarily have enough supplies to pre-position across the city. Things expire, things like formula and food and other things. I know that some groups, such as the Red Cross, are looking into pre-positioning of supplies, but any facilities that may meet some of our requirements, we're happy to talk about those facilities. I don't know that they would be designated. One thing is, emergencies and things are very site-specific, and we never want to send anyone into danger. So if we, picked a facility and it turned out that there was a hazardous materials incident right next door, and people just heard that there was an evacuation to a local shelter, they may not have the full information, and they may go and unwittingly put themselves in danger, and that's not something that the city wants. So that is our policy. Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay. That our policy in general, but we're always, our GIS department that does all this mapping and everything, they're very interested in all buildings across the city, what their capacity is, if there's backup generation, all kinds of things. So we're happy to learn of new facilities and explore ways that we may be able to work together and during emergencies.
Okay, I'm going to, Rick is going to ask his question, then I have questions.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions? Write them down, please.
Yeah. Did you say at the beginning that under the new evacuation plan, all of Roosevelt Island would have been evacuated because of Hurricane Sandy?
That's our understanding. Obviously, it's hindsight, looking back. The evacuation that we called would not have been all. Looking back, under these new zones, we would have evacuated the whole island. But is that your question? We didn't ask for a mandatory evacuation of Roosevelt Island for Irene or Sandy. Under this new system, which gives us a lot more flexibility, and we can kind of carve people into 500,000 person groups as opposed to 1 million. You know, if a Sandy-like storm were coming in the next couple of weeks, it's very likely that the entire island would be under a mandatory evacuation.
Okay, just one other question. There is a Roosevelt Island evacuation plan which has never been made public. Is there any reason, to your knowledge, why a Roosevelt Island evacuation plan could not be made public?
That is an OEM plan. I don't know if that's a question for the public safety director or the police department, but that's not a plan that's under our purview.
Jack, would you come on, please?
There is a plan. It's terribly outdated. It came from Patrol Borough, Queens North, which is the borough where we reside here. And I'm working with the NYPD to bring it up to date.
And will that be made public?
Pardon me?
Will it be made public?
I see no reason why not.
Thank you.
Sure.
So the answer to that question, will the plan be made public?
What's the question?
Will the plan be made public, the evacuation plan? There's no reason for it not to be made public when it's updated. That's good news. That's good news.
In speaking with Ellen over the last week or so about this event, I know we're keeping track of the questions, and I hope to have a follow-up meeting where we can, if there are questions that I can't address today, we'll address them at the next meeting. So keep that in mind, please.
Okay, so we'll answer some of these questions, and maybe they duplicate some of the other questions that people have. Roosevelt Island has 3 zones. Will they all be evacuated, or will some zones be evacuated and others not? Yes, that's correct. There are now 2 zones on Roosevelt Island, and there is a possibility that the majority of the island, which is, I believe, Zone 3, will not be evacuated, while Zone 2 will be evacuated. They're also asking to give the zones for the different buildings on Roosevelt Island, so I looked this up out of my own curiosity, and you can go online as well and look it up. 888 Main Street, which is the Octagon, is in Zone 2, which is the outer edges of the island, and it appears that the rest of the island is in Zone 3.
One question is, why can't PS IS 217 be Roosevelt Island's evacuation location? I assume you're talking for coastal storm. No location that's in any of the 6 zones can be an evacuation center, because that would obviously put people in harm. That building, I don't know. Well, the whole island has always been in the zone, right? So that's why it's never been designated. If you look at the map that's over there, you have to be out of the zone. There were 50 schools that used to be out of the zone that are now in. As I said, if there were a smaller type of incident, such as a full-on power outage or something, that could serve as a smaller shelter. But no area that's in an evacuation zone will be a shelter. So that's why no location on the island is a coastal storm evacuation center.
There was a little conflicting information that you just gave. Is Zone 3 mandatory?
It depends on the storm. The whole reason that we gave 6 zones is so we'll have more flexibility. They are cumulative, so if a storm is coming up, the first thing we would look at is Zone 1 and say, okay, we're going to evacuate Zone 1. You guys are not Zone 1. Zone 1 is Lower Manhattan, Coney Island, the Rockaways, part of Staten Island, so that's the first area. That's the area at greatest risk. Then we would look at Zone 2. As Rachel said, there are some locations here that are in Zone 2. I don't know that that's the only building in the hospital. So there are those. We would then go to a Zone 2. Then we would go to Zone 3 and onward up to Zone 6. I mean, one thing I will say, and I live in northeastern Queens near the Whitestone Bridge in Zone 3. If something like Sandy were coming, or if a storm were coming, whether, I would obviously be at work, my husband would be home with our children and our pet. If a storm like that were coming, even if Zone 3 wasn't called, we would evacuate. Because, there were power outages during Sandy, there's other things, there could be a tree down at the base of your street, which could, so even if there's not a mandatory evacuation, for your safety, for your comfort, personally, I would, if it's not too disruptive, I would err on the side of going somewhere a little further inland for a couple days, just to not put yourself in a situation that may be, unpleasant or, not where you want to be.
And then to piggyback on what Christina just said, one of the questions here is what level of hurricane, what category of hurricane or tropical storm would trigger an evacuation? The categories are not tied to the zones, and I think that's important that you recognize that and that pay attention to the information coming out. That a category 2 hurricane does not mean that zone 2 will evacuate. So that's why it's important to break that distinction away in your minds and to just consider that you live in evacuation zone 1 or 2 or 3, but it is not aligned with the hurricane category.
Yeah, one thing I mentioned at the beginning is if you look just at the category of the storm, Irene and Sandy were both tropical storms. They were both within the same area. Obviously, Sandy had much more devastating impact, much greater forces than Irene did. So the category, as Rachel said, it's more the bearing, certain things, the time of year, the tide, all different things coming into play. So that's why it's really important to have access to Notify NYC, to the REOP alerts. One thing that we haven't mentioned is we also have the advanced warning system, and that is something that our Human Services Division set up along with the Human Resources Administration, Department for Aging, Department of Health, other human service type organizations, and that goes out to 750 organizations that provide services to people. So visiting nurse service, hospital, social workers, different groups like that. So they receive information from us, and then we urge them to pass that information on. If they help people, maybe try to help them evacuate, help them to get some extra supplies. So that's another resource that we have for caregivers, for organizations to help serve their clients.
Okay, this question is, we are a population of 14,000. The tram and the ACT train are not going to do the job if the island must evacuate. What about help from the city? We spoke yesterday to one of our colleagues who works in transportation unit, and we wanted to get some numbers, and one of the numbers that we came up with is that the F train can hold a capacity 2,500 people. So in the event of an evacuation from Roosevelt Island, which would be 2 to 3 days before the trains or the trams would stop running, we would hope that people would take advantage of that. And also keep in mind that not everybody around the city will be moving. People will get to where they need to get and they'll stay still. People in the zones will be moving. So we feel based on that people who wanted to evacuate should be able to evacuate. Did we miss anyone's questions? A lot of them seemed duplicative, so no?
I just want to say one thing on the tide. The tides here don't have a significant effect on flooding. Where they are right here, the difference between high tide and low tide is about 2 or 3 feet. It's really the storm surge, which has to do with the bearing.
Yeah, really the tides are Lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan is a big difference, but here it's, in 96th Street is one of the main measure points. It's only about 2 or 3 feet between low tide and high tide, and at the extremes. So when you see full moon or it's going to be a big tide, not a major issue for us.
I'm just wondering, how will we be notified? If I don't watch TV or I'm on the radio and I'm not on the internet.
She said, how will she be notified if she doesn't watch TV or have the radio or register for Notify NYC?
That we're going to have.
Right, but can I ask you, why would you not register for Notify NYC? We're making resources available, and you know, I mean, if people don't, if they choose not to avail themselves of certain resources, you know, there's a card over there. If you go to nyc.gov or call 311 this evening, they can register you for Notify. And as I said, you can only sign up for your zip code. So if you don't want to receive, you know, many messages, you can get it. You don't need the internet. They call landlines. You know, we have many different ways of getting information. I also know that, you know, there's a fire house right near here. You know, for the last 2 storms, when we called an evacuation, our partners in the police department, the fire department have gone out with bullhorns. You know, they've worked. You know, we were on every TV station. We were on the radio. You know, we use every channel possible. You know, we also help. You know, I understand the housing here is high rises. Rachel had said they post things in her building. You know, we help at the building management and other things. And then also, you know, we counsel people. We ask them to be good neighbors. If you live near someone who is elderly or who you think might need a little help, or you know doesn't always, you know, watch TV or read the paper while you're evacuating or while you're making your plan, you know, it would be a nice thing to do to also knock on their door and just see if they need any assistance. You know, if you can help them, dial 311 or, you know, do that. I do that with my neighbors, and that, you know, this is a close knit community, and you know, but.
I just wanted to add, we'll be working with the different building management entities that are out, that we have on the island here, in order to explore what kind of notification system is in place already in the event. It will be a redundancy that will be, but we take responsibility for that, not for it entirely. I think a lot of the message here tonight is individual responsibility. We should be availing ourselves of every piece of information that's out there in order to be better prepared. We have lists of where the different disabled folks are. Those lists are kept current so that we can assist our disabled neighbors in getting out in an emergency.
In 2005, those of us who had friends who had those wheelchairs with battery or that they blew into, we learned that they had 6 hours of power in that battery. And when we said, where is the nearest generator, it was at each end of the island, at each hospital. With Cornell taking over that hospital, are we going to have a recharging station down there, or only Goldwater? They've got 6 hours and then they're dead, so that's our problem.
That is not something that OEM is involved in. I don't know if any of the people here know. You know, I know that, you know, whether it's something like a coastal storm, you know, one thing we said is, the good news is that the closest evacuation center, Julia Richmond, is a special medical needs shelter, which is always on generator power. And if there are other types of emergencies, you know, there's a fire station there. But the specifics of what's going on with Cornell is you know, not something we're working on.
I think with the new hospital coming in, there's going to be a period in between, and I'll find out exactly.
It's not a new hospital.
Excuse me?
No, the hospital.
Oh, I meant the okay. Pardon me. The school.
Yes.
The hospital leaving and
the school.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. I stand corrected. But the point I'm trying to make is that there will be a slack period in between with the new construction, and I will find out if there will still be availability in that one location, and I'll find out if any others exist.
One question that I think has come up in several different ways is, what if there was an earthquake? What if there's a tornado? What if there's a tsunami? You know, outside of an earthquake or tornado, those are no-notice events, which, you know, means that we don't see 3 days in advance something coming up. You know, it depends on the scope of something. If something happens in Midtown Manhattan or Upper East Side, and you know, tremors or things come out this way, or vice versa, it would be part of a larger evacuation. If it's something more localized to the island, you know, there could be some shelters like we talked about. You know, one of the things, and Jack had said it, is, you know, we're talking about planning. We were here tonight to talk specifically about coastal storms because that's obviously a large threat and something that everyone who works or lives on the island faces. But many things can happen. And the one thing we know is the next storm or the next large event that comes won't look like Sandy. So we're not planning for the next Sandy. We're looking for, we call it all hazards planning. That includes man-made events, accidents, all different type of things. A lot of the principles that we talk about, getting emergency information, having a go bag, having a plan, knowing where you can evacuate to, or vice versa, where someone can come and stay with you. Those are the principles. That's something that CERT is based on, and I'm sure CERT members can talk to you more about that, filling out your emergency plan. Emergencies are stressful, and a lot of times people, children, people with disabilities, anybody, you may be having an okay day and you may be, everything might be going okay, and then all of a sudden when an emergency happens, you could forget your phone number, you could forget what medication you take, your husband's work number, I don't know, it affects you in different ways. So having things written down, cell phones are great, but they die, cell towers go down, all different kinds of things happen. So having redundancies, having those plans in place, that's really our message, there's so many different things that could happen in so many different ways that, instead of worrying about every specific case, it's much better to look at a plan overall and think about what you would do, who you would call, what supplies you would need, and sleep a little more soundly at night.
We have one question here.
Sure.
We live on an island, a small island, and am I the only one who's been wondering about this? What happens if something goes wrong, and for some reason we can't use the single bridge that gets us off the island? Or if we find out, because the storm changes direction at the last minute, and the subway's already shut down, and there's no way to get off the island, what are you going to do? How are you going to get closer to 15,000 people off the island?
When a storm changes direction, it changes direction 3 days out. It doesn't change direction when it's bearing down on the city. As we said, that's why we call for an evacuation a couple of days in advance. There is a time when the subways are shut down, when we say it's not safe for first responders to come anymore. If people have made a choice to not leave the island, there is a time when we can't guarantee that we'll be able to send anyone here. When the gale force winds, when they reach a certain degree, the bridges are shut down. And that happened during Sandy. We were in the emergency operations centers. We were getting calls from people in southern Brooklyn that, had been asked 4 or 5 times to evacuate. They chose not to. They're trying to call 911. They're calling us. They're calling the state. And, at that time, it's heartbreaking, but there's nothing. You tell them to try to go to higher grounds. Part of this is the personal responsibility and, making those decisions. But with a coastal storm, it's not going to be like, we thought that things happen at the last minute. It's a different, we have several hours, and like I said, I would err on the side of evacuating for a couple days and then coming home and saying, oh man, I guess things didn't really happen here, as opposed to the scenario that you're talking about.
The question is, forget about the storm. What if it's an attack and we are stuck in this island? What's the plan?
I think that's the plan that you're talking about with the public safety director that you're going to talk about in the future.
I think so, but I think we're all sensitized to this because we have had an experience where the bridge was stuck in the up position, nobody could get off the bridge, the subway was closed, and nobody could, the tram was closed. The tram was down for repairs, and we had to, I think we had to have...
The subway was not functioning, and the bridge was stuck in the up. Nobody could get on and nobody could get off. We really experienced that. So that's why
people are nervous about that.
finding something on the island, a location on the island.
As far as an attack goes, I think that's, it certainly needs to be addressed and discussed. I think for another time though, and there are so many factors that go into that. And I know that we'll get help from the city. We have a nice relationship with 114 Precinct, the patrol borough over here, the different task forces that work in Queens, and they've committed to help in an emergency.
Thank you. So we had another question about getting our 12,000 people off the island within 3 days. Is that possible?
As Rachel mentioned, we spoke to our transportation planner yesterday. His calculations are an F train running for an hour, 15,000 people. You know, if it's 2,500 people and it runs 6 times an hour, or whatever the math is, that they could get off in an hour. We obviously would do it based on 26 or 36 hours.
Is that with the people from Queens on it or not?
The issue is that, as Rachel said, most of Queens will not be evacuating. If you look at the coastal zones, they're a very small area. And so, you know, most people are not, when an evacuation is being called, thinking this is a great time to go to the movies or do those things. And the MTA, we work very closely with them. They also put additional resources. They would run extra F trains, or they would shorten the route, you know, do things to help the people that need to evacuate and people that should shelter in place and ride out the storm, you know, take the resources from that area.
We had one more question about a tornado. Do we have tornado? What if we had a tornado? Would there be any shelters on Roosevelt Island for that?
The city does have tornadoes. We had 2 last September, one in Canarsie and one in Breezy Point. A tornado, you get a warning about 20 minutes maybe before, if you're lucky, before a tornado comes through. You know there's severe weather, there's thunderstorms. We do, through Notify NYC and other things, as soon as we have information, we issue that. You know, tell people to go away from windows, come in from outside, and those kind of things. A tornado goes through very rapidly in a matter of seconds. Once the damage is assessed, you know, we would look, it's not, if you look at maps of ones that have come, it's a very specific swath. It's not, you know, like it would come and it would be a line through the island. We would, you know, obviously there would be 911 and first responders, and if it were safe to have something like I talked about at a school or at another facility on the island, you know, we would do that, or we would look to transport people to another facility close by.
We also had a question about a mass emergency where we needed to get out quickly. How would we do that? And I think you might have just answered that with the subway.
Several times. Yeah, I mean, that's part of a larger response. You know, talking to the public safety director and to the police department, and you know how things would be happening across the city.
We're going to take 2 more questions, and I see a lot of hands up. So if your question has sort of been asked already. Okay. Judy.
We all forget one thing. We have Bird Escolar Hospital on the north end of the island. They were completely flooded out, blacked out for days, on generators for months. They now have all new utilities on the 2nd floor, and they're still rebuilding, but you know they're fully functional. They were not evacuated. 100 patients were sent to Goldwater, which will not be an option after October 30th. It was safer to keep 600 people in the hospital rather than try to traumatize people after an incident like this and move them out of a hospital. FEMA came in, they did the best they could, everyone made it through. It is many times in hospitals and situations like this safer to shelter in place than to move medically fragile people. I'm very curious. What are you going to do if another Sandy hits Bellevue, NYU, the VA hospital, Coney Island Hospital? What are the plans for those sites if there's another storm? Because they've all been retrofitted. But what's the answer?
So if you look at Irene and Sandy, during Irene, this is really under the purview of State Department of Health and City Department of Health. They regulate and run these facilities, and they make the determination on evacuation or not. During Irene, they decided to evacuate certain hospitals and nursing homes, and as you point out, people are medically fragile. It can be more damaging to evacuate someone. During Sandy, they made the opposite decision not to evacuate. There were certain requirements put in place. Hospitals had to have 150% of their staff. They had to have extra gas, all different kinds of things. Obviously, the Con Ed substation explosion, what happened on the east side, then, you know, there and facilities in the Rockaways, there were evacuations that went on in darkened stairwells and in NICUs and things like that, which was obviously far from an ideal situation. All of that is being taken into in the city's after action plan that I mentioned, the playbooks looking at you know, what regulations where people can go. So, you know, I don't know the answer to that question at this point. You know, I don't, the state health department, the city health department, they're putting these things in place, and, you know, they'll take these recommendations and and decide, you know, based on the next storm, what they think is the safest course of action.
We have one more question.
Right.
Hi. I'm directing this to Director McManus. I was happy to hear you say you're going to tell us what the evacuation plan is. As a CERT member, we've been frustrated not to know what it was because we could be deployed to help with that evacuation. The reason we were given was that terrorists would find out, and they don't want terrorists to know because terrorists have targets of a bridge, subway, and power plants, and we have all three here. So we were told, so if you are given that reason by the powers that be, I hope you'll at least tell the CERT members what the plans are so we can help in an evacuation in that case. We really need to know ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we will. There's no reason why that has to be, there's no reason why that needs to be confidential. It becomes very public once people are given direction as to where and how to get out. So there's no reason, I have enough experience to know that something like that doesn't have to be kept hidden.
Oh, all right. We have to move on. I would like to introduce Jane. I'm sorry? She's on her way? Okay, great. So, okay, why don't we, what I would like to do, let me just explain before everybody leaves. We have the next presentation.